Hello plant lovers, it is Matthew in Melbourne welcoming you back to my channel, and if you're new here, I grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids here in Melbourne, Australia without any grow lights or greenhouses or humidifiers, just me and them either inside or outside, or they're out of the pool. So plant lovers, if that sounds like your conditions and your bag, then do hit subscribe. I post every Friday. I'm a complete amateur. These are just my learnings and ramblings about how things have worked, or sometimes not, for me here. And if you're a frequent viewer, you might notice different glasses. I've just realized that I actually see the camera a whole lot better with my reading glasses. So there you are. I have been dancing in the dark for quite some time. But this video, plant lovers, is all about Cymbidiums. Now, it is mid-autumn here in Melbourne, in Australia. Obviously, we're in the Southern Hemisphere, and the month is April. So we are heading into our winter, which is never a great time. But anyway, such is life. You in the Northern Hemisphere, of course, heading into spring, and a very different part of the Cymbidium cycle, but we'll get to that. So what I thought I would do in this video is just go over this season, autumn, and what is going on for Cymbidiums at this point, because it's a bit of a tipping point. So in spring we've had our blooms, our flowers have died, and really in summer the plants don't do a whole lot. They just are. They're photosynthesizing and they're being. But now as we head into autumn here in the Southern Hemisphere, as the nighttime temperatures start to drop and the days shorten, then things start to happen in our Cymbidium world. And I thought, I'm going to show you what's going on with mine right now. First thing then, I have made many Cymbidium videos, and the most popular one that I've made was called Cymbidium Rescue, which is like a pet rescue or Baywatch. You know, I'm running down the beach in Speedos, saving Cymbidiums. Not quite, it was quite chilly. And here is that plant that we rescued quite a few months ago, and is the start of the video that I'll link above. And so, yes, here is the start of Cymbidium Rescue. So this was from Cousin Josh's house, and that is what my label says, Cousin Josh, June 2022. So it is now April 2023, and this plant has had a winter and a summer to do its thing, and I'm here to report it's done very well. So in autumn, what you should be generally seeing is the beginning of your new growth. So these are all hybrid Cymbidiums we're talking about at the moment. We might get to some species ones later on. These are all hybrids. And the life cycle for these is that we get our blooms in spring. Those blooms then die, you cut off the spike, and you basically then have your strappy green leaf plant for all of summer, madly photosynthesizing. Then as the season changes into autumn, you start to get your new growths appearing, which will mature over the autumn-winter period and be the ones that bloom for you in the next flowering season, next spring. So with this one, it was quite a beast of a plant, and as you can see, this growth here is the new growth that occurred for me. That growth is now beautifully maturing, and I've got 5 pseudobulbs. I wouldn't be at all surprised if I was able to get a bloom from this in spring. Cymbidiums often don't respond well to repotting. I mean, they do in the long term, but short term you can sometimes run the risk of missing a season. However, I have also had many instances where that's not the case, and it hasn't sulked and it has bloomed after a repot. So this one has got its fabulous new growth, and it's not looking bad. But I think what is more interesting about this one is that you might remember there were a ton of pseudo back bulbs, really old ones. You can actually see in the middle there, which I'll come in and show you closer, is one such a back bulb. So there were so many of them, I didn't have the heart to throw them all away. I also don't know what bloom this is because I never saw it in flower. So what I did was pot up each of those kind of dead looking back bulbs. Time to visit them. So here we are. Exhibit A is one of the back bulbs that I potted up. So as you can see, you want the smallest pot that the bulb is going to sit in, really. So these were all leafless and looked just like that, pretty dead, but they're not. So they're really still fat and firm, and they're not wrinkly, no rot. There's a whole ton of energy in there and the capacity to start a new plant. And what we can see just down there, green shoot. So that is the first new growth coming out of this pseudobulb. Now it's probably going to take at least 3 years before I get enough growth points for this to flower, but we'll see. I will certainly keep you up to date with how this is going. So this is what happens when you pot up your sort of redundant back bulbs from Cymbidiums. I did this in June last year, and it is now April, so nearly 12 months ago. It just sat and sat and sat. And now that it's autumn, that growth period has been triggered and we've got our new growth. And by spring, we'll have a strappy new green-leafed bulb emerging out of this plant. So that is the cycle of your back bulb planting. Now the important thing is with these is to keep them dry, because even now there are no roots yet with this. So even though I've got a little green shoot, the green shoot is coming from the energy of the bulb. No roots have been produced. So you still want to really rein back on the watering. So when you first pot them, just leave it completely dry. And then as we started to get into autumn, I have occasionally watered it just to keep this mixture moist-ish, but then really let it dry out because they will rot really quickly. However, once you see roots really going for it, and you'll see them coming out of the bottom, and you might even see them poking out the top, then you can really start watering it and feeding it regularly. So that is the cycle of our back bulb repotting. Now I have a funny cautionary tale for you, plant lovers. I produced a whole tray of these, so there must have been 9 pots each with a back bulb in, keeping them dry, as I said you should. But what I didn't realize is that the tray was sitting under some hanging baskets. And whenever I watered the hanging baskets, they dripped onto the pseudo bulbs and the entire lot rotted. Every single one, because they got too moist. So there's a cautionary tale. This one didn't fit on the tray, and it was in a much drier corner just on its own. Didn't rot, and it's producing a new growth. So there you go. Really don't do anything. Put the bulb in some medium, and I just used out of the bag orchid mix, which is medium-sized bark and sort of a bit more grainy and gritty. I just left it in that. Don't water it. Wait until autumn when you start to get your new growth. Let that grow up a fairly reasonable amount, and you're sure that there's roots starting to grow. Then you can gently start to water and feed it. But there's my cautionary tale about how to rot potted up back bulbs. Okay, here is the start of my other orchid rescue, Cymbidium rescue. So this was a no ID hybrid, and this is the one that came from my mother-in-law's house. Now, unfortunately, she died many years before I ever met her. And my father-in-law, who's still alive, and he's still alive since the video, he's now 94, going strong, still lives alone, still drives, still runs the Trugo Club. I'll link the video above and you can find out just what Trugo is. But this was that orchid that I featured, and I wanted to show you what this is doing now. It is autumn, and it's a little bit advanced of the back bulb that I just showed you, but what you can maybe see here is 1, 2, 3 enormous and very healthy new growths. So when I repotted this, when I first rescued it, there was, I think, sort of 3-ish pseudo bulbs, 1 old one, a back bulb, and 1 bulb that had some very straggly leaves. So it took about 2 years to recover, and it had been neglected for nearly 20 years. No water, no food, nothing, the pot on its side, getting occasional rain. Last year it flowered for the first time, which is wonderful, and I was able to show John. But this year it has put on more growth than I've ever seen. So 3 new growths, which is wonderful, because that means these will mature over autumn, and I might well get 3 spikes in the flowering season, which is spring. Anyway, let's see how we go. But I wanted to show you just how healthy and happy this one is, and really how simple that process is. If you didn't watch the video, it is a large pot because the root mass was quite big, and I have just used out of the bag orchid mix, which I find works really well for Cymbidiums. And a little sidebar to that story, John, my father-in-law, bless him, Easter obviously was this month. I'm filming this in April, and he gave us both Easter cards with $10 in it, which is so sweet. I'm 55. That's the sort of thing that used to happen to me when I was 10, and it's so lovely. Both my parents are long dead, so it's so sweet to get a card with money from a relative. Anyway, I thought, what am I going to do with this $10 that will enable me to remember John by? And I thought, you know what, a Cymbidium seedling. So what I did, I went out to Collector's Corner, which is a great nursery here in Melbourne. I'll put the link below, and I've made a video there about Phalaenopsis. One of the few places in Melbourne you can actually go and buy mature orchids and orchid divisions, orchids in bloom, and vandas actually. And this is a seedling called Ruby Eyes Tetra Baron, and it is bright red. Now, who knows if it actually will look like that. So this is a cascading one. So you basically have 2 types of Cymbidiums. Cascading, which are smaller plants and produce pendulous flowers that cascade. And then you have your upright Cymbidiums, which can get to be quite massive plants with quite tall spikes of blooms multiply. So if you're a bit pushed for space, the smaller, more compact cascading Cymbidiums are a great choice for you. And these work really well in hanging baskets as well. They're elevated, the flowers hang down, and you look up at them. So to celebrate John, I have bought this orchid with scarlet flowers. We'll have to wait another 2-3 years before we get a bloom and see what it's like. But if we're all still here, I'll show you. And I chose this particular seedling out of all of the many others because, as you can see, and I'll come in and show you, you can just see there are the silhouette. That little nib there is a new growth. So this is year 1. That means we're going into the 2nd year, and usually by year 3 or 4, a seedling Cymbidium will be ready to bloom. So you need at least 3 pseudobulbs. So this one will grow over autumn, winter and mature, not to the point where it can bloom. And then in next autumn, hopefully that will produce new growths. And then the following autumn, another growth, and we might be ready to bloom by that point anyway. Isn't that a really healthy looking plant? And I am looking forward to seeing what those flowers look like. Now, the other autumn catch-up was a seedling that I bought, and I made a video actually about repotting Cymbidium orchids. And while I was repotting it live, I realized that all the roots had basically rotted on one particular one. But here it is. So this is now quite a few months later. We've had lots of new leaf growth, and the plant, I staked it because it was a bit wobbly. The plant is really solid in the pot, and I can see that it's developed lots of roots. You can often see the roots just coming out from the top of the pseudobulb there. So this one has recovered quite well. As you saw with that back bulb, if the pseudobulb is sort of large and mature enough, that contains all the energy the plant needs to regenerate. So even if you've got a rootless plant, but you've got pseudobulbs, you might be able to still save it. This was a real baby though, so that pseudobulb wasn't really very large, and there were a few viable roots left on it. But anyway, I wanted to show you that. It is doing really well. Now, I'm not seeing a new growth. Oh, I might just see a little swelling at the bottom, who knows. But because this plant was at a bit of a back foot, having no roots, I'm gonna forgive it if it just spends this first year of its life with me focusing on its root system. So what else should you be doing during autumn? Well, not much really, but as the season is changing, it's important that Cymbidiums get a little bit more light if you can give it. So if you're somewhere which has freezing winters and you can't keep yours outdoors all year like I do, if you're able to put them outdoors during summer, spring, summer, autumn, depending how cold quickly your weather gets, under dappled light, which is a great way to summer Cymbidiums outside. You can do that in Britain, North America, as long as you don't get once in a lifetime cold snap. So if you summer them outside, as the nighttime minimums start to decrease, it's great because they need that cold change in season to trigger the flower spikes, but they also can do with a little bit more light at this point. Imagine they grow in quite moist, temperate forests, some of which are part deciduous. So there is generally more light penetrating where these plants are living in the winter period. So a little bit more light. So if you're moving them indoors to overwinter them, just make sure they're in somewhere with really bright diffused light. And if you can get some direct light on them in the morning through a window, that'd be fantastic. For me, where mine are growing, they're under a row of silver birch trees, which are obviously deciduous and will drop their leaves. So by default, in winter, I get more light coming through those trees because there's no leaves and hitting the plants. So all of mine flower in the position that I've got them. It seems to suit them really well. So if you remember, all the species Cymbidiums that the hybrids are largely derived from are all Himalayan Cymbidiums. So they grow in reasonably high altitudes, the lower slopes of the Himalaya, but it does get cold in winter. The season really changes. And they're epiphytes, which means they are living on trees, but these are sort of more like forest floor plants rather than certain other epiphytic orchids that can grow right up in trees. So these tend to be quite low in the canopy. So they are getting quite a lot of dappled light, but just more in winter. But talking of our species Cymbidium friends, what are the species Cymbidiums doing in autumn? Well, the curious thing is that a lot of the species Cymbidiums from that part of the world, so we're talking that band across southern China, Yunnan province, which is sort of next to Vietnam and near Nepal, so that sort of band of the Himalayas across there, which is where a lot of Cymbidium species come from. A lot of those bloom in autumn. which is right now. Now I have this species, which is called Cymbidium erythrostylum. There you go. I've made a video about this one. The flowers are stunning, really large and sort of slightly sad. They look like a basset hound, but the most beautiful white with quite striking magenta inside the lip of the flower. And this is an autumn flower, and what I will do is come in and show you that we have got our flower spike just emerging down there. Now this is a seedling plant. It's a smaller plant, so it's not going to get as big as some of the hybrid strappy ones, but it is not a compact pendulous one because they are the results of hybridization, but it's nonetheless a smaller plant. The flowers are just stunning. So with your species Cymbidiums, if you're growing them, and why wouldn't you, because they take the same conditions as your hybrids, you will get flowers much earlier in the season, or later, depending which point of the calendar we're sitting on. But these are going to flower for you in sometimes late summer and into autumn, depending on your relative climate. Now the other thing to observe at this time of year perhaps is yellowing leaves, and you can see quite clearly on this one. Now that's a natural process. What you don't want is your new growths emerging in spring and those leaves immediately looking yellow. Something's going on there. But what we can see, this is one of the oldest pseudobulbs from the seedling plant, and the leaves are turning yellow, and that is quite natural because that pseudobulb is now shedding its leaves, it's done its business, and you can pull them off or trim them off if you so desire. They are done. But it's not a terrible thing, so don't panic if in autumn some of your older back bulbs start to look really shabby, turn yellow, and ultimately fall off. Natural process. Now, my other species is this one, which is really quite curious. This is Cymbidium maguanense. There we go. And I think I've included this in a video. It's named after the town in Yunnan province in China where it was found. The other species that we were just looking at, erythrostylum, is actually from northern Vietnam. Similar conditions, just a different geography. So this one is southern Chinese, and this has a very interesting growth habit. As you can see, it grows sort of monopodially, even though it's not, because it's got multiple stems, but it basically keeps growing up, producing leaves, kind of like a vanda. And the other odd thing is it also flowers late summer and autumn, depending on your season. It's coming into spike for me now, and it spikes from basically the stem in between one of those little leaf joints, as a vanda does. Quite curious. So this is a Cymbidium orchid that can continually flower from the same stem, we'll call it, but it's a pseudobulb at the base of the stem. So quite an unusual flowering habit. Now I will come in and show you. Here is the flower spike. So it's coming out of that crevice of a leaf in the stem. Beautiful white, very delicate flowers. And most of these have a light fragrance, these species ones, very beautiful. So this one is getting ready to bloom now. I am very happy. This is the first full year I've had it, and I repotted it in spring. So I'm glad that it is looking happy. Now, as you can see, there are 3 other growth points, but they're a little bit younger. Quite clearly, this plant needs to mature a reasonable amount before you'll start to get flower spikes. So it's a little different behaviorally to our and its hybrid cousins. Otherwise though, exactly the same care. It's getting dappled light, and it's getting slightly more dappled light in winter, and of course cool nighttime minimums in winter, which the change of the season will stimulate the flowers for you. And again, if you grow hybrid Cymbidiums, you'll be able to grow the species Cymbidiums that grow in the same place. And often you'll find Cymbidium specialist growers will have species on their list for you to buy as well. Now, autumn, heading into winter, the other quirk I think for Cymbidiums, unlike many other orchids, and we might actually use the seedling as our demonstration model because it's easier. So what you can see is you have got this new growth coming. So, and you can see that too in our Cymbidium rescue. All those fantastic new growths emerging. So the plant is really active at this time of year, heading into winter, which means, plant lovers, you need to keep watering it and feeding it. So in summer, these plants are effectively not doing very much. They're just sort of sitting there. They've done all their big thing. They've had their growth spurt, produced their new growths, had their flowers. They just rest in summer. But what I will do as we now going into autumn and winter is actually feed these. And I use a liquid fertilizer, and it's either an orchid specific one or it is a general all-purpose fertilizer, liquid fertilizer. And, or I use non-fertilizers, which are tonics, and they can often be seaweed-based or worm tea, worm juice, whatever you want to call it. Which a viewer did actually ask me, what, are you saying worm tea, worm juice? I am. If you've got a worm farm, which are those sort of plastic boxes essentially that you put household food scraps in, and actually cotton, worms eat cotton, so it's a great way to put your old cotton clothes back into the nitrogen cycle. If you've got a worm farm, then the worm farm lets off a juice, I suppose, and you collect it in a cup. It's a bit like tapping rubber trees, you know, the juice runs down the tree into a cup. So you save that juice, and it's highly, highly nutritious, full of all sorts of wonderful biological treats for your plants. So you collect that, and then you dilute that. Use it in the same manner as you would a fertilizer. Dilute it down to sort of 1/10, 1/8 of the recommended dose of a fertilizer in your watering can, and just water them whenever you wish. Very, very nutritious and great for the plants. So throughout autumn and winter, I do that. Not a huge amount, maybe every 3 weeks. If I remember, I'll give them a quite low dose of a fertilizer. But in spring, I do the topical application of a slow release fertilizer. But I think the thing to remember is with Cymbidiums, you do need to still be active watering and fertilizing in the winter months. Now, don't keep them too wet because they don't like soggy feet and they will rot. So you've got to find that happy medium, particularly if you're growing in a place that's much cooler than me in winter. So if you're in the Northern Hemisphere where your winters freeze and you bring them inside, again, don't overwater them in winter because they don't want to be cold and soggy, because that will kill them. And then, as I've mentioned in other videos, if you were going to repot them, just wait until spring. Wait until any flower has finished and died, or if you've got a seedling, just wait until the weather starts to warm up and pot it on. Now this little seedling here, I'm not going to bother repot. It's going to be quite happy in there for at least another year. It's not very attractive, but there's sort of no need at this point. Cymbidiums do like to be quite root bound. They're epiphytes, and they grow in those nooks at the bottom of roots or lower branches of trees, so the space is quite constricted. Don't overpot it. Really wait till it's starting to push its way out. And if you watch the Cymbidium rescue video, you'll see just how enormous those plants can be and still bloom in a very tight pot with almost no medium left. So they are tough orchids and very rewarding though. I know people often struggle with Cymbidiums, and I think the key is they do need a cooler winter, and they do need relatively good winter light to get them to bloom. Of course, we're just talking about hybrids. There are species orchids that have tropical conditions. So there are Cymbidiums that you can grow in warmer or tropical environments. So the Australian native Cymbidiums, for example, grow much further north in tropical parts of the country. So there is still options for Cymbidiums for you lucky people living in the hot tropics, whereas us, me here, just heading into winter, it's certainly not tropical. So there you are, plant lovers, a quick Cymbidium roundup. I'm just glad one of these did survive and is shooting, despite my best efforts to kill every other by rotting them. I will, of course, in spring follow up with all of these and show you what's going on when they come into bloom. But in the meantime, if you want to know what I'm doing next week, hit subscribe. I post every Friday. My amateur ramblings will continue. So until then, I hope wherever you are, all's well, that your orchids are thriving, and I look forward to seeing you next week.